This is a re-upload of a video that I did about a month ago. There's a lot about it that I wanted to fix up, primarily with the background music, and there were some numbers that had to be fixed. If you've already watched it, it should more or less be the same. You probably won't notice that drastic of a difference, nor a different conclusion. But I did want to upload a better version, especially since the Switch 2 is about to come out, and Did You Know Gaming just did a video about the price hikes of Nintendo. So since I've been wanting to fix this video up anyway, I figured this is a good chance to do it. Hope you enjoy. Is it more expensive today to game, or was it more expensive in the previous generations? So I came across a website called spritesell.com, and on there they had a ton of video game catalogs. I'm talking they date back to 1975. I don't intend on going back that far. I barely wanted to do the 80s, but since we're going through it all, we might as well do this. I'm going to start with 1986 because that was the first year that the NES started to show up on the catalogs. The Hills was selling the NES for $80, and it included 2 controllers and Super Mario Bros., with an average game price of $25. We're going to treat 1986 as year 1 of the NES. Technically, it came out in 1985, but I don't have any data for that year, and I figure it's close enough. So $80 in 1986, adjusted for inflation to 2017 when the Switch came out, is $177. And $25 in 1986 comes out to $55 in 2017. So let's say you got the NES, it comes with an extra controller as well as Mario Brothers, and then decided to buy 2 games at $25 apiece. So basically a console, 2 controllers, and 3 games would put you at $130 for 1986, which comes out to roughly $288. If you were to treat each Joy-Con as an individual controller, which I know in most cases none of you would, but a Nintendo Switch alone would be more than that $288 anyway. When you're looking at adding 2 or 3 games, you're easily looking at over $400, which is a pretty stark difference. There's a Sears catalog from that same year that looks like the console is up about $10 more than this one is, and some of the games are $5 more, as well as a Target advertisement that looks like it requires you to buy the bundle with Rob and the light gun. But it seems like outside of that bundle, for the most part, you're looking at roughly the prices that I mentioned earlier. Even with the added $20 if you bought it from Sears instead of the Hills, you'd still be under $350 for a bundle like that. And it seems like Toys R Us is roughly in line with that as well. We can kind of skim through 1987, it seems like the prices stagnated. By 1988, a lot of NESs were being bundled with the light gun, but if you looked around a bit, you could still buy it without one. Having the light gun plus Duck Hunt would have added an extra $20, but that's really an extra game as well, so I'm not sure how to calculate that. I think we'll just keep it at $80 because you could still technically buy the NES without the light gun at the time. But there were some games that started to release at $45. It seems like for the most part, they were averaging around $40 for the new release high-end licensed stuff. Those games would be considered $83. So I'm going to do the same bundle. It comes with Mario, the 2 controllers, plus we buy an extra 2 games, and we're going to put them at the $40 price tag, even though technically you could have bought some for $25 and $30 as well. So the bundle at the time would have cost $160, and since that's 2 years into the NES's life, we're going to put it as comparison to 2 years into the Switch's life. So to 2019, and we're sitting at $348. 1989 seems more or less the same. This is kind of cool, but not completely relevant to this, but in 1990, they had a sports set. It came with a dongle that lets you plug in 4 controllers. It actually came with the 4 controllers, as well as Super Spike Volleyball and Nintendo World Cup, all for the low price of $150, which I think would be like $340 in 2021, but we're not doing that one. So nothing substantial happened in 1990. The Sega Genesis was still way overpriced and wasn't selling. The NES hadn't really changed that much over the past few years. But in 1991, you had games like Mega Man 3 and Mario Bros. 3 coming out for $50. There were some other big ones like Final Fantasy coming out for $50, as well as Sega Genesis still being high as hell, except dropping it down $10. But come the fall, the Super Nintendo started to show up in the catalogs. At that point, it had launched at $199, and the Sega Genesis had dropped down to $150 and included Sonic the Hedgehog. But those console sales were still not doing well, neither for the Super Nintendo or the Genesis. Again, you can go to videogamesales.com, or you can look at my previous video about the topic. Most people did not buy these consoles until they had a price drop. But as far as the NES is concerned, let's increase the game prices to $50 to see how that changes. Let's say you decide to do the same thing. Buy the NES, it comes with Duck Hunt and Mario and whatever, which is going for $80 now. And then you buy 2 $50 games. This is in 1991, so it's 5 years into the NES's life. As compared to the Nintendo Switch, that would be 2022. Adjusted for inflation, each one of those games do cost $104, which means that $180 bundle from 1991 would be the equivalent of $375 in 2022. At that point, it's starting to get close. If you're strictly looking at the most expensive games, you could probably get away with buying another 2 NES games until a comparable bundle with the Switch might be actually cheaper, but this is also with the assumption that you're buying games at the most expensive value. So it's getting close, but it's not quite there yet. I think depending on how many games somebody owns, they could argue it in favor of the modern day, but this is also with the assumption that you're buying the console in 1991 or in 2022. It's a lot more nuanced, it's harder to compare. Let's keep going. At some point, it should be a much clearer distinction. Now, once you get to 1992, both the SNES as well as the Sega Genesis had dropped down to $100 for just the console and the controller. The Genesis did have a bundle where it included Sonic for an extra $30, and the Super Nintendo included Super Mario World with an additional controller, but that was still at $149. The prices kind of started to vary at this point between $40 and $60 for the video games, but it seems like the most popular ones, your Marios and Zeldas and first-party titles, hovered around the $50 mark. If you shopped around, however, you could get that Super Nintendo bundle for $140, and by this point in time, the NES bundle was including Mario 3 in addition to the stuff that I was already including before, so we can probably skip the NES for 1992. We'll just look at the SNES since it was a little bit more expensive than the Sega Genesis. So keep in mind, in 1992, the Super Nintendo was in its second year, which would be the equivalent of the Switch in 2018. So the $140 console released at that time would have been the equivalent of $250 in 2018. But a $50 game would come out to $90. So for that same bundle, the Super Nintendo with 2 controllers, as well as 3 games including Super Mario World included, is $240 in 1992, which comes out to $430 in 2018. So once again, if you were to buy 1 or 2 more games, you're probably spending more than you would on the Switch, but it's still close enough. Keep in mind, you're also not paying for an internet, you're not paying for a subscription service, console storage, all that other fancy stuff. So it's kind of like still in the ballpark. When you jump ahead to 1993, the Super Nintendo doesn't really change that much. You do find a lot of deals that include Super Mario All-Stars in addition to Mario World, so you could argue that you pretty much didn't need anything else at that point, but we'll just ignore that one. The cooler thing in 1993 was the NES. So you're looking at the end of a console's life cycle when the next one had just come out, basically. So it shouldn't be too different to compare to the Nintendo Switch in 2025. Basically, by 1993, you could pretty much find an NES anywhere, and it includes 2 controllers and Super Mario Bros. 3. But in addition to that, the major first-party titles, your Legend of Zeldas and your Metroids, were dropped down to $30. So at that price point, that comes out to roughly $66, which is comparable to the first-party titles today. You'd basically be able to buy a console with 3 AAA first-party titles, Zelda, Mario, and Metroid, as well as an additional controller, for $150 in 1993, and that's the equivalent of roughly $335 today. You can't even get a Nintendo Switch with one of those games today. And with how cheap NES games were at that point in time, you can buy as many as you want, and you can buy as many Switch games as you want, and it will always be more affordable to play the NES in 1993 than it is to play the Nintendo Switch today. So as far as the NES is concerned, it started off more affordable than the modern console. It eventually became kind of on par, maybe a little bit more expensive depending on how many games you buy, and then it came back down to being drastically cheaper. But let's keep going. By 1994, you're able to get a top-loader NES for $50. I think from that point forward, we can just assume that the NES was more affordable than the Switch. I don't know how much the Switch one will drop from now until 2 years from now, but I highly doubt it'll be as affordable as the NES was that far after launch. But also, by that point in time, you can probably shop around and find a Super Nintendo for close to $80. And even if you don't shop around, you can get it close to $100, and it'll include Super Mario World as well as Super Mario All-Stars and another controller. It seems like the Sega Genesis was running similar deals too. I think how easy it was to find that kind of deal depended on the time of the year too, but I think being generous, we can say that for $130 you can get Super Mario World and Super Mario All-Stars as well as an extra controller. And then something like Super Mario Kart, for example, would be $50. So 1994 was 3 years after the Super Nintendo came out. If you compare that to the Nintendo Switch, you would be looking at 2020. So basically, if you're thinking about buying the Super Nintendo, and then you would also get the mainline Mario game, as well as the All-Stars pack for the previous games, and also Mario Kart, you're looking at $180 during that time, and that's including an extra controller, which would have been $317 in 2020. If you got the same bundle, but on the Switch in 2020, that would have been $480. Now, given that the average Super Nintendo game price adjusted for inflation was close to 90 bucks, you'd eventually get to the point where having the Switch would be cheaper than having the Super Nintendo. But I would also argue that if somebody offered me a Nintendo Switch with Mario Kart, Mario Odyssey, and Mario 3D All-Stars for only $317, and the condition was that every future game I buy would be $85 or more, if I decided to buy a game, I'd probably take that deal. But yeah, similar to pretty much all of the previous years, if you're just looking at that basic bundle, it's still cheaper in the 90s, but there will be a point in time after buying AAA title after AAA title after AAA title where it would be cheaper in today's day and age. But let's continue to 1995. It seems like with the Super Nintendo, you can kind of shop around and find some price cuts. Mostly later on in the year, since the Nintendo 64 was coming up, you could get the console for like 90 bucks. Super Metroid was on special for like 30. Kirby was 20. The newer titles were still high up there. Yoshi's Island and Donkey Kong specifically were going for 55 bucks. But all in all, throughout the entire year, it seems like it was more or less similar to 1994. So we can probably jump straight ahead to 1996. Once again, based off of the information that I found on video game sales that I had shared on my previous video, the PS1 and the Nintendo 64 started to sell overwhelmingly more units in 1997 when their prices were close to 150 bucks. Yeah, the Nintendo 64 was basically 25% off within a year. And the following year, it was at 130. And the year after that, it was at 100. But that's not a discussion for right now. By the time you got to 1997, you could pretty much find a Super Nintendo for under $100, and it would usually include at least one game. If it was Donkey Kong, it would probably be close to 99 bucks. If it was something like Killer Instinct, it would be $80. Almost every mainline first-party game had a drastic price drop by that point too, but new releases like Super Mario RPG and Donkey Kong Country 3 were hitting $70. But basically at that point, you could get the primary games that you wanted. Your Zelda, your Mario Kart, your Mario All-Stars, even your Super Star Wars. All of those were running for $35. We can average it out to like $40, I guess, because it seems like most games are 35 bucks, and I don't think that many people actually bought Donkey Kong Country 3 anyway. This would be 1997, which is the 6th year of the Super Nintendo's life, so you're looking at 2023. So it's basically the equivalent of the Switch itself costing $150, and any game that you buy would cost close to $75. So now you're looking at that same bundle, 3 games, 2 controllers, comes out to roughly $376 if you account for inflation. So it's back to that price range where it's similar, but if you bought a few more games, eventually it would be cheaper to be a modern gamer. Now looking at the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64 paints a little bit of a different picture. The consoles are $150 and the games come in around, on average, roughly 50 to 55 bucks. By this point in time, the console started coming with a single controller, so realistically speaking, you're buying a second one. You could potentially also be buying 4, but I think to balance it out a bit, we're going to say that we're buying one Nintendo 64 controller additionally, but we're also buying one more Pro controller for the Switch. So instead of assuming that Nintendo 64 costs $150, we're going to assume it costs $180, because controllers were way more affordable back then. And keep in mind, in all of my previous calculations, I assumed that you were just playing with Joy-Cons. I know for a fact most of you either bought additional Joy-Cons or bought extra Pro controllers. But I didn't want to start taking that into consideration because the Super Nintendo and the NES were mostly coming with 2 controllers anyway. But now, we're buying controllers. So the Nintendo 64 comes in at $180. We'll say the average price for a game is roughly $55. And we're going from 1997 to 2018. So if you bought a Nintendo 64 in 1997, bought an extra controller, and bought 3 video games, you dropped roughly $345, which in 2018 money is $538. Roughly $20 cheaper than the equivalent on the Nintendo Switch. If you were to buy one more Nintendo 64 game, you would actually break even. If you bought 2 more games, it would be cheaper to game in 2018 with a Switch. So you're looking at buying 5 games on the Nintendo Switch in order to make it cheaper than the Nintendo 64. Or at least that's the case in those consoles the second year of their life. Now, in 1998, a year after this, you're able to get a Super Nintendo for 50 bucks or a Sega Genesis for $30. Now, these were redesigned budget versions, but the Switch doesn't exactly have a budget version. It has a handheld version in the Lite, but that's not a home console. You'd have to compare that to the Game Boy, and that would be a whole nother study that I have to do, and I'm not doing that. Well, I guess unless you guys ask me to, then maybe. But the point is, Sega and Nintendo made consoles that you can play the games on, so it counts. But anyway, you could get a Super Nintendo for $50 at this point, and all of the main games look like they were roughly around 30 bucks. So we're looking at 1998, which is 7 years after the console's launch. So we're going to be comparing that to 7 years after 2017, which would have been 2024. Now, mind you, I'm looking at the most expensive Super Nintendo games for the time. I'm not looking for the cheaper ones because you can go down to $20. But those $30 games in 1998 are worth $57 in 2024, which is comparable, basically the same price. But the Super Nintendo costing $50 in 1998 is the equivalent of $95 in 2024. So that same bundle, if you were to buy a Nintendo console with 3 games, is $140 in 1998, which comes out to $267 in 2024. And at this point, the games cost the same. So no matter how many games you buy, it's going to be at the same rate. Which means, similar to the NES, once you hit that 6 or 7 or 8 year mark, it's no longer even a competition. It's clearly better in the 90s. So we'll have to see if this applies and if we can all get Nintendo Switches for $100 in a year or two. But I highly doubt it. But in 1998, you could also still buy the Nintendo 64, and now it had actually dropped down another $20. Game prices were roughly the same, and controller prices as well. So if we're comparing 1998 to 2019, that same discussion from 2 years prior is roughly $30 cheaper in favor of the Nintendo 64. So that break-even point that was roughly 5 games gets pushed back another game or two. But it's a similar discussion. Once you buy more, it'll be better in favor for the 2019 gamer. Now, by 1999, especially the end of 1999, you're able to get a Dreamcast for like $100, but that was kind of a sad story, so we'll leave that one. You're also able to get a Nintendo 64 for $100 at that point in time, and it comes with 2 controllers. Remember, this is 3 years into the console's life. Also, while there were some new Nintendo 64 games that hit $60, the average mainline Nintendo 64 game had actually dropped down in price, so it's closer to $50 a game now. So now, looking at that same bundle, 2 controllers, 3 games, in a third year of the Nintendo 64's life, that would cost $250, which is the equivalent of $392 in 2020, which was the third year of the Switch's life. That Switch, with 3 games and a Pro Controller, would be $550. So while each Nintendo 64 game adjusted for inflation between those 2 years would be $78, there is over $150 of wiggle room here in favor of the Nintendo 64. So once again, it got close for a while. There was kind of a sweet spot where if you bought more than 4 or 5 games for a couple years, it would be better to be a modern gamer. But similar to the Super Nintendo and the NES before that, and actually in this case it happened much quicker, if you give it a few years, it's much more affordable in the 90s. And this was only 3 years later. This was the equivalent of 2020. Speaking in Nintendo Switch terms, of course. Now, not much changed over the next few years. The PlayStation 2 launched. A lot of people bought it, but once again, most people waited until there was a major price drop. Early adopters got screwed for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube because by 2002, they were all noticeably cheaper, and that's actually when the majority of people started to buy in. I don't think it's fair to only look at the Nintendo console in this one, since it was cheaper than the Xbox and the PlayStation 2, whereas the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1 were kind of hand in hand on prices. But basically, by 2002, the GameCube was at $150 and the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 were at $200. So I'm going to split it halfway and use $175. I know technically it should be closer to $200, but again, I've been sticking with Nintendo, so I'm going to put a little bit more weight on that. After all, I'm comparing this to the Nintendo Switch. I'm not comparing it to the PlayStation 5. Speaking of which, all of the comparisons I've made would also be completely viable against the PlayStation 5 or the Series X. The big difference is those consoles' games go on sale quicker, so that shift of how many games need to be purchased in order to balance it out might change. But given those consoles are over $100 more expensive than the Nintendo Switch, it might not actually change that much. I'm only saying this because I know one of you guys are going to be like, well, of course, you only compare it to Nintendo, and those games never go on sale. But if you do the comparison, I'm comparing it to the Switch because the Switch is still the most affordable console to play unless you bought like way too many games, and specifically only bought them on sale. At a certain number, the PS5 might be more affordable in that case, or even same idea with the PS4. But yeah, generally speaking, the Switch is more affordable. Anyway, back to the Cube. During this console generation, games were basically standard at $50, and the controllers were between $20 and $30 depending on the console, so we'll say $25. Most consoles came with a bundle of your choice of one game. In the GameCube's case, it was mostly Mario Sunshine. So you're looking at $175 for the console plus an additional controller is $200. Games are $50 a piece. This is 2002 being compared to 2018, which means the console plus an extra game plus an extra controller would have been $280 adjusted for inflation, and the games would be the equivalent of $70. So only $10 more than what was normal for the time. But yeah, for that same bundle, you're looking at $420, which is actually cheaper than what the Nintendo 64 was in its second year. Now granted, this is because there was a game packed in. If you remove that game, then you're looking at $490, which is still cheaper than what the Nintendo 64 was, but much closer to it. So here's the thing, we are now in 2002. Like I mentioned in the previous video, and like I've mentioned earlier in this video, consoles in general, when adjusted for inflation, were cheaper. Except for those people that bought them exactly at launch, which are not even remotely the majority. It got pretty close around the Wii era when you adjust for inflation, and it got even closer when you get to the Wii U and the PS4. But in pretty much every generation, if you didn't buy the console in the first 6 to 12 months, which wasn't really that common in the 90s by the way, not many people were early adopters. That didn't become more common until the late 2000s. But yeah, unless you were an early adopter, you probably got the console for much cheaper than what a modern gamer would get theirs for. Which means I don't need to continue to do these calculations for the consoles, because in the upcoming generations, between the Wii, 360, PS3, PS4, Xbox One, and even the Wii U, console price drops happened within a few years, and they were much more significant than the price drops we're seeing currently, or lack thereof rather. The most critical thing that I needed to compare was for the costs of the games. And since I've gone through the 80s and the 90s, which were not only the times where the costs of the games were at their highest, but the variance between the inflation was also at the highest, we can most likely deduce that going forward, we're going to be seeing similar patterns here. Because once you get to the Wii and the Xbox generation, those $50 games in 2006 are worth $61 in 2017. And if you want to push it forward, they're worth $80 today, which is pretty much going to be the standard price for the next generation. If not, it's up by $10, which isn't that big of a difference. It makes the comparison a little bit harder, but it's still close enough. But at that point, you're also considering that the Wii is going from $250 to $400 in 2025, which is $100 cheaper than the $500 Switch model that comes with a game, because the Wii also came with a game. Again, it's comparable, and if you buy enough games, it might come out to being cheaper now. But the conclusion I have when you include the games is a very similar conclusion to the one that I had before. If someone was to buy a console and buy games immediately in the first year or 2 years of their launch, gaming would be cheaper if you're only looking at the inflation. We're removing all other external factors. Remember, we already determined that we don't care about how many incomes a family needs to survive, or what percentage of the average person's income is actually going to savings now versus what went back then, or the fact that you could have worked on a paper route and somehow used that money to pay for college. We're not counting any of that stuff. Strictly looking at it from an inflation angle, if you buy the console early on, and you buy the games early on, and you buy a lot of games early on specifically, then yes, modern gaming is cheaper. But back then, a vast majority of people did not do that. They waited like a year, 2 years. Consoles went down in price, games went down in price as well. During that second and third year when people started to buy, it's comparable. If you buy 4, 5, 6 plus games, at some point you'll hit a moment where it is cheaper to game today than it was in the 90s. But if you're just buying 3 games and 2 controllers, at no point in time was it more expensive back then than it is now. And I realize most people buy more than 3 games. But how many people do that in more than a year? Because if you're buying those 3 games and 2 controllers in 1997, by the time you get to 1998, the games will drop in price. So it's a bit harder to calculate, but this is what I mean when I say it's comparable. But once you hit year 4, 5, 6, which many of us did back in the 90s, we bought consoles and we kept playing them for a lot longer than people do now. The NES was shining much more during the early 90s after the SNES had released. And likewise with the SNES after the Nintendo 64 came out. It really wasn't that uncommon to keep playing that same console for a few years more and then adopt the next one. I would say, based off of everything that I just calculated, for the most part, unless you're somebody that buys 5 to 10 games in the first year that a console comes out, it was definitely going to be cheaper for you back then. And again, this is without adding all of the external factors. But there is one factor that makes me even more confident, in my opinion. And it's not the accessories, it's not the SD cards and the hard drives, it's not the controllers, it's not paying for online, it's none of that. It's the video game rentals and the used game market. You could rent a game for under $5 and beat it in a week and give it back to Blockbuster. A lot of us did that. Every week, you could walk down the street to a garage sale and buy a shoebox full of games for $10. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've done it with my own hands. And it's not something that was rare. It was pretty common. And these weren't games that were like from the previous generation. These were games from 3 or 4 years ago. There was a very healthy used game market and a thriving rental industry that meant that you could experience an entire console generation without buying a single game brand new at full price. Like, I remember going to the store and buying Super Mario World for $10. That was what, 20% of the sticker price? And Nintendo would actually resell these games at a cheaper price later on in the console's life cycle as well. I didn't even consider that yet. You know, like in the Wii U, they had the Nintendo Selects. They had similar stuff in every generation leading up to it. It wasn't until the Switch that died out. But my point is, when you consider the used game market, when you consider all of the rental stores that were available around you, there is zero doubt in my mind that gaming today is cheaper than it was back in the 90s. Not adjusted for inflation, not adjusted for anything. That's a fallacy. It's just blatantly not true. It's a marketing lie that we're being fed to make us okay with modern day prices. These companies are the same companies that are fighting against the used game market. And in addition to all of the different streaming services, they're the same ones that fought against the rental stores. They want us to have to purchase the games on their terms at the prices they set with zero alternatives. And they've been moving closer and closer to it every year. And it seems like with the next generation, they're actually going to have completely gotten there. In the not too distant future, physical games could very well be a thing of the past. But yeah, I did the research for you guys. I spent a lot of time on this one. I tried to be fair with which catalogs I chose. I tried to be fair with giving average prices. But also, you should consider that the price of the Switch 2 is in a vacuum. It's the same Nintendo that's charging for both of these consoles, that being the Switch 1 and the Switch 2. It's fine to assume that $450 is reasonable if it wasn't a price set by a company that is by nature being unreasonable. Many of you keep trying to separate that $450 price tag and only focus on the games, on the accessories, on the subscriptions, etc. But that $450 price tag is more expensive than any other previous Nintendo console would have been. Or at least if you waited a year or two in every other console. But I'm going to call it from now. The Switch 2 will be the same price in 2 years from now, if not more expensive. But again, even if you want to say it's a different type of Nintendo, it's a different type of power, it's worth that $450 price tag, you cannot separate it from everything else. These are not individual parts of a discussion, it's all part of the same greater discussion. It's the whole Nintendo package. Games prices, consoles prices. Previous generation games and console prices as well. Upgrade packs, no official drop in price of anything, weak bundles, game key cards existing, and especially the most offensive part of this whole situation, the fact that Welcome Frickin' Tour costs $10. It's all the same discussion. Stop separating it. Stop whataboutisming it. And for the love of Hylia, stop defending it. I'll catch you guys on the next one.